Welcome to American Christian or Christian American. I'm Sean Legacy and I'm your host. If you would consider hitting the subscribe button to keep track of the videos that I'm putting out, that would be helpful. Today we're going to do a little recap, and if you've just joined me, I would think that it'd be wise, if you really want to get the context to what I'm talking about, is to go to my channel, which is at the beginning of my third and fourth episodes and so on, and see the first ones that I've done. This is episode 4, and what we've done so far is we're setting groundwork for further study as we move along. In order to do that, we have to go back and discuss history that has been distorted purposely. Who were the first people? That's who we discussed in the beginning. We discussed that as science has looked at different things about our genetics, as history and as well as common sense, the only people that could have been the first people are a medium brown complected people, because they're the only ones that produce a variety of different skin shades or skin tones. Only from them could lighter people come from and darker people come from. Of course, it didn't just happen instantly, but it happened over time. And in particular, it happened after the flood, because all the people were concentrated together up until the flood. It wasn't until the Tower of Babel where people went off in different directions. We talked about the 3 sons of Noah, and we talked about the fact that Ham, Shem, and Japheth were all still brown-skinned people. However, Shem would have been in the medium brown area probably, and Japheth maybe a little bit lighter. Ham would have been a little darker. Ham is known historically to be the father of what we know as black people or African people. Now, white supremacy in this world has used that to say that there was a curse, that everybody else is white, and Ham was turned black because of a curse that happened when Ham saw his father's nakedness. We already took care of that, the fact that the curse wasn't on Ham, it was on Canaan, and it had nothing to do with skin pigmentation. We also talked about the fact that scientists have shown that we are 99.9% identical. It's only that fraction that makes us different. It is impossible for us to be multiple races. We are all the same race. The reason we have the term race and all these divided up into different races is social construct, meaning that people who wanted to degrade other people and make themselves look better, and what we're talking about here is whites and white supremacy, use this idea in order to degrade and dehumanize people who didn't look like white people, especially Africans. This doesn't make white people inferior. This means that we're all equal, that we're all created by God. Whites weren't first, but we are all created by God. It also makes sense that Adam and Eve, who were naked in the Garden of Eden, wouldn't be white. Their skin would be exposed to higher levels of solar radiation and would have sunburn on their private parts and everything else, the areas that are very sensitive. God wouldn't have put light-skinned people, especially when they were going to be naked, in that particular environment. So it makes sense that people would have been more prepared to survive that environment. Now, white people did live there later, but they were also clothed. They also covered their skin to protect it. So we have to think about what's logical, not of what has been designed to control, to dehumanize, and to degrade people. Why is this important? Well, I just said it. It's important because it has been used to dehumanize and to degrade people and to create a particular group of people being superior. White supremacy. Now, if we all got along and we all didn't, or at least we didn't divide by skin pigmentation, which is the most ridiculous thing in the world, if we didn't do that, then maybe the history wouldn't be as important if we didn't judge people that way, but it is, and so it is important. And so that's why we're looking at this. We've moved on, again, talking about Ham and his 3 sons, 4 sons. Ham gave father to Canaan. Canaan was inhabited to the area of Palestine, where the Israelites would later inhabit. Cush inhabited Ethiopia, and also in the land of Nubia, which is known for the land of burnt-faced people, being some of the darkest complected people in the world. Now, those people have spread out in different locations, but this is where they started. The Egyptians, who were also African people. Now, even though there are lighter skinned people later on, they weren't in the beginning. They weren't through all this early years of history. Now, after invasions and different things that happened, yes, there would have been impact. But even with Egypt, or Mizraim was his name, some of his children went also to inhabit the area of Palestine. So he had a strong African presence even before the sons of Shem, or say Abraham and his descendants, the Israelites, were in the area. But even when they were there before they went into Egypt, they were in close proximity to the Canaanites. So we have the strong African presence that maintain within the Israelites and within the African nations. Now, I've also mentioned that people today, historians, try to make Egypt white, try to make everything else light or light-skinned people, to take away credit from the African people that lived there. Now, yes, they were inhabited later, but they don't want to give credit to black people because they said they were inferior, that they didn't know anything, that white people had to educate them. We're going to show as we move along that it was actually in the reverse, that African people educated Europeans in many ways before Europeans colonized and destroyed much of Africa and took away the learning abilities that they have, and therefore they could call them inferior, which is simply not true. Within each different definition of people, if you want to divide them by skin tones or eye color or whatever else, there are people who have less ability in learning abilities, but they still have gifts. There are people who are highly exceptional, and then there's a lot of people in the middle. It isn't dictated by skin color. If the opportunities were equal, we would all have those different levels of people depending on their gifts and their attitudes towards those gifts, whether or not they waste those gifts or they use those gifts. My grandfather had a brother, and his brother had a photographic memory. He could take anything and copy it perfectly, a painting, anything, read a book, memorize every comma and period in the book. But he wasn't original about things, and he leached off of other people, and he died at 33 years of age of cirrhosis of the liver. He drank himself to death. So he had gifts, but he didn't use them. So we all have different gifts. Sometimes people have more, but they don't use them. And somebody who has maybe less gifts, utilize them to the fullest and become very prominent people. We need to stop judging people by silly things like the color of their skin. But it takes away power from people who wish to control others, who wish to have dominance, to wish to have superiority. And many of those people are claiming to be Christians. They're not. Not when they do this and what the awful things that they have done to people. We're going to get more and more into that. I'm going to show you more and more facts as we move along. But right now, we're going to be talking today about David to Jesus. But we're going to back up just a little bit, even though the title says that, and we're going to discuss a little bit about Moses and then move on to King David and then to Jesus. So let's take a look at some interesting facts. Okay, here we go. So the Israelites lived in Egypt for 430 years. We know the story of Joseph, or at least most people do. I'm not covering all this right now, but you can look it up in Exodus 12, 40, and 41. But baby Moses, because the Pharaoh had decided to kill all the firstborn of the Israelites, because he was afraid about the numbers of Israelites that were growing in Egypt, and he was trying to keep them down and keep them in slavery. So, killing all the firstborn males. So his mother decided to put baby Moses in a bassinet, wrapped up, and then sent down the river. She followed him as he went down the river, and it arrived to where Pharaoh's daughter was there, and she saw the baby and took him in. Now, both of them had to have an African skin color because we know the Egyptians at this time were darker skinned people. We also know that Shemites were as well, and they intermarried with the Canaanites. But this shows here, she pulled out Moses out of the river and decided to raise him as her own son. She was a daughter of Pharaoh, and Pharaoh accepted him. He didn't stand out, so he couldn't have been white. Otherwise, he stood out. If the Israelites were white and he was white, then Pharaoh would have said, this is an Israelite child. But the fact is they weren't. Now, of course, they say, historians say before, both the Israelites and the Egyptians were white. That's just ridiculous. That doesn't make any sense with known history, with what we understand about genetics today. None of that makes any sense. So we're once again talking about the fact that just a little bit more evidence to the fact that these were darker skinned people. Now, backing up just a little bit before King David, we looked at this in the last presentation. Rahab was a harlot. She was also a Canaanite, but she helped the spies who went into the land of Canaan, and so she was spared. Being a Canaanite, she was descended from Ham. She had darker skin. She and her husband gave birth to Boaz. Boaz married Ruth, who was a Moabite. Who were the Moabites? Well, it descended from Lot's daughters. Lot, his wife, when they left Sodom and Gomorrah, was commanded not to look back at the city. His wife did, and she was turned into a pillar of salt. Now it was just Lot and his wife, or his daughters, and his daughters decided, well, who should we have no one to marry and carry on our family line. So they decided together to get their father drunk twice. And each time they got drunk, they would sleep with him and become impregnated by their father. And one of these daughters was the creation of the Moabites. Ruth was a descendant from the Moabites. So Ruth actually is related to Abraham if you go back through Abraham and Lot. So now, Ruth's son, the son Obed, who was the father of Jesse, and Jesse was the father of several sons, and his youngest was David, future king of Israel, the United Kingdom. Jesus was a descendant of the line of David, as was prophesied. Now we have two different people here to pay attention to, Solomon and Nathan. And first of all, before that, King David and Bathsheba. Now Bathsheba is the one person where David's castle or his home, he could look out and he saw the beautiful Bathsheba taking a bath. And this got him taken down a road that he shouldn't have gone down. He called for Bathsheba and slept with her, and she became pregnant. Now, Bathsheba was was a wife of Uriah the Hittite. The Hittites were part of the Canaanite clans. Bathsheba also came from that area. So these were darker skinned people. Now, the first child between David couldn't get Uriah to sleep with his wife, so he could try to hide the fact that the child was his, because it would work, because both Uriah, both Bathsheba, and David were all within the same complexion tone, so there wouldn't be any surprises if somebody different had come along. Well, it didn't work. So David orchestrated the death of Uriah when they went out to the battlefield, to pull back from Uriah and allow him to be killed. So David murdered Uriah. Maybe not directly, but he did. David was called by the prophet and said, "You're guilty of this." And so the son that David and Bathsheba had would die. Nevertheless, God is known for taking bad situations and sinful situations and turning it around for the good. Two of the sons of King David and Bathsheba, as he took her as his wife, were Solomon and Nathan. Why are these important? They're both in the line of Jesus. Both? Yes. Here's the thing. In Matthew, you have the genealogies that go down from Solomon all the way down. I'm sorry, the screen has cut off just a little bit here. And then you have in Luke, it goes from Nathan down to Jesus as well. Now, this is confusing a little bit here. It's confusing because, well, one thing in Luke, the genealogies go backwards. I've just turned them around from Nathan. And they also go all the way back to Seth. Seth was the son of Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve, after Cain and Abel, Abel was killed, Cain was avenged, and then Seth came along. Seth is a direct line all the way down to Jesus, showing that God brought from the first Adam all the way to the second Adam, meaning the first man and then the first man of where God brought salvation to human beings, which is the second Adam, was Jesus. Now in Matthew, it doesn't go all the way back. It goes back to about Abraham. Both of these lines go towards Jesus. How can that be with two different lines going down to the same person? They don't. They appear to, though. See, Solomon was the line going down to Joseph, the husband of Mary. And Nathan was the line going down to Mary. So there's two different, both Joseph and Mary were descendants of David. Now it gets confusing because it doesn't mention Mary. Why not? Because women weren't mentioned. It also is confusing because it says over here in Luke that Heli was the father of Joseph. No, he wasn't. He was the father-in-law. But they didn't have a term for that back then. So when they married, the wife's father also becomes the father of the husband. They just never said father-in-law. But we've got two different people coming down to it. Now, why is it important for Joseph and Mary both to be descended from David? Mary provides the physical connection to David and all the way back to Seth, because she has that physical genes that goes all the way back. That's what's important there. Matthew shows from Solomon Joseph's genealogies. Because, see, in this time, he not only needed to be descended physically from David, he needed to have a legal connection. And the legal connection went through the father. So Joseph, who was not biologically the father of Jesus, brought the legal connection to David, and Mary brought the biological connection to David. And what's interesting is that several times within this history, Canaanites have intermixed with the line of Jesus. Further evidence showing that Jesus was not a light-skinned person. He was actually a dark-skinned person, more of an African-looking person. We don't know exactly what shade, but we do know he had influence of African genes. Also, the children of Shem also already were darker, just maybe not as dark as the African genes, but with the intermixing, it kept them pretty dark. Now, this is some other evidence, and some people would say this is figurative. I say that it's further evidence. And if it was just this and none of all the other things I've talked about, maybe you could get away with saying it's only figurative. But this is just another piece of the puzzle. Daniel 7:9. As I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was as white as snow. The hair of his head was white like wool. So it talks about his hair texture being like wool. Europeans don't have anything that's like that. We say, well, that's the hair color. Well, let's look again. Daniel chapter 10, verse 5 through 6. I looked up, and there before me was a man dressed in linen with a belt of finest gold around his waist. His body was like crystallite or jewels. His face was like lightning, his eyes like flaming torches, his arms and legs the gleam of burnished bronze, and his voice like the sound of a multitude. Bronze. What is bronze? Bronze is a brownish, dark color. There are different variations of bronze, but it's still dark. Revelation 1:14. His head and his hair were like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were like blazing fire. His feet were like bronze glowing in a furnace, and his voice was like the sound of rushing waters. So these last scriptures we just talked about with the prophecies and things could be looked at as figuratively in some ways. And I think there might be some figurativeness to it, but also it does show the bronze or brown skin of Jesus, the hair or wool like African. Now, if that was the only evidence by itself, maybe it could be dismissed. But I don't believe it can be dismissed when you have all the other evidences that are there. And literally, there is no evidence in the Bible of Caucasians. All the evidence points in a different direction. So this is just another part of it. Now, also, I want to point out that not all preachers or ministers have gone with saying that Jesus was white. And I'm going to show you now a clip of an example of Billy Graham, who, while he doesn't specify as much, he does say some truth here. And I think this is important to listen to in context.
Thorns on his brow and his face was bleeding. And they laughed at him and they spit on him and they mocked him. And with one snap of his finger, 72,000 angels had already drawn their swords ready to come to his rescue and wipe this planet out of existence in the universe. And Jesus said, no, to this end was I born. And he dragged and lifted and hauled that cross. And don't you black people ever forget one thing. The man that helped Jesus carry that cross was a black man. And don't ever forget another thing. Jesus belongs to Africa as much as he does to Europe and Asia. He was born in that part of the world that touches Africa and Asia and Europe, and Jesus was not a white man like me, nor was he as black as some of you. We don't know what the color of his skin, but it must have been a dark color like the people of his day, because he was a man like them. Don't ever say it's a white man's religion or a black man's religion. It's a world religion. He belongs to the world.
It really is good to see that not every single person supports the lies that have been put out here. Now, Billy Graham may not have known all the details, but he knew enough to know that it didn't make any sense that Jesus would have been a white man, that Jesus would have been light-skinned like him, like me. Jesus is the Son of God for all people, like he said. He's there for every one of us. He loves every one of us. And we all should celebrate Jesus. But we should celebrate him how he was. Not because it's important that he has a better skin tone, so to speak, but that we can knock down those people who try to use Jesus to hurt other people. Jesus is not about the hurting business. Jesus is about drawing all of us near. And we don't need to have people full of hate preaching his word, to twist it around and to make it so they can gain power and control over other people, to be selfish, self-righteous, and to dismiss other people. But that's the kind of country we live in, the world we live in, and we're going to deal with more of this. I hope you'll continue listening. I hope you'll subscribe, because we have a lot more to talk about. And I know for some of you who listen may be really upsetting to you because you haven't heard this before and you've been led to believe something else. But I promise you, you can be more enriched if you hold strong. Thank you for joining me on American Christian or Christian American. Until the next time.